recording now that we will be recording this session and it will be posted on our website also within a few days following. If you go off the state website and you look for Department of Human Services, then look for Division Rehab Services, and it's on the left-hand side called the Provider Resources. Again, that's where we have put the handout, and that's where we will have the video archived afterwards too. So, also, I do want to mention that we are offering continued education credits for this webinar, but one of the requirements we have when we do continued education credits is how do you verify the person attended the session. So at the very end of the PowerPoint, there is a link for people to do a short survey, plus also put their information on if they would like continued education credits. We do have a code that people will get at the very end of the session to confirm that they were listening to the presentation, and they will need to enter that into the SurveyMonkey webinar to order to get the continued education credits. We're doing the continued education credits for the Commission Rehabilitation Counseling Certification. We refer to the CRCs. Plus, we're also doing it for the Certified Employment Support Professionals. Again, I will mention that again at the end of the session. And at this point in time, I think we're ready to begin our presentation called Service Animals and Emotional Support Animals, Who Goes Where and Why. Our presenter today is Dr. Jane Jarrow. Dr. Jarrow is the founder or the president of Disability Access Information Support. She provides technical assistance and professional development activities to various higher education communities surrounding issues of accommodation supports for students with disabilities. Her bio was included in an announcement, so I'm not going to go through and read all that, but I do want to mention that we've had the opportunity to have Jane come to South Dakota on occasion, and also again this coming summer she will present at our disability coordinators meeting that we have in Chamberlain, where the post-secondary disability coordinators are present. Dr. Jarrow is located in Columbus, Ohio, and that's where she is presenting at today. So during her session, she will tell me what slide that we are on, and I will run PowerPoint for her while she is connected to audio. So we have quite a bit of technology. So hopefully all this technology works together. If it doesn't, I apologize. Again, there will be people that I may mute on the session at times. And because if you don't have your system muted, that if you ruffle papers or something like that, we will be hearing that. So I'll be kind of going through at times, and if I see people are not muted, I'll mute them. So again, Jane, are you there? I'd like to turn it over to you.
I am.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me just add one piece to the logistics. My understanding is that the screen you're looking at has the opportunity of a chat window. If you have questions as we go along, I can't see that chat window, but Bernie can. So if you have questions, go ahead and type in your questions, and he will stop me and throw the questions in as we go along. I talk whether anyone's listening or not, so it won't bother me to be interrupted. Please ask as we go. There will be some points along the line where we actually stop and say, okay, let's take some more questions before we go on to a new topic. With that having been said, Bernie, the second slide, slide number 2, just says, why are we here? So let's get started and move on to slide number 3. The question of internal or external, are these rules that apply just to some places or more broadly? Let's get that part laid out first, and then we're going to talk about it in some detail. The Department of Justice, what I'll refer to today as DOJ, has carefully set out rules regarding service animals under the Americans with Disabilities Act. They put out a set of rules in 2010, which are kind of the basic guidelines that we run by. And then in 2015, they released an update which was essentially frequently asked questions about the guidelines from 2010. Those two pieces from DOJ are what give us our marching orders as it refers to service animals in public. Both Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and the Department of Transportation, DOT, have less specific rules that are starting to be fleshed out regarding emotional support animals. The housing rules for emotional support animals show up in the Fair Housing Amendments Act, or the FHA, and the rules regarding airlines and airports come up under the Air Carrier Access Act, which is overseen by the Department of Transportation. So we've got the DOJ rules regarding service animals that apply broadly under the Americans with Disabilities Act. As a subset, or as a separate piece of that, HUD has rules under the FHA regarding animals in housing, and the Department of Transportation has its own Access Act, the Air Carrier Access Act, that relates to animals in airlines and airports. Got that much? We're going to review those rules as they pertain to you as employees, as coworkers, if you have someone else in your office who has a service animal, or and certainly the clients you serve in terms of what their rights and responsibilities are if they have either a service animal or an emotional support animal. Let's move on to slide number 4. For clarification, service animal rules come from the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Department of Justice. They do not come from Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. We're used to generally saying under 504/ADA such and such and such and such, because for most public entities, both of those rules overlap and always have. This is the exception that proves the rule. There is very little in Section 504 that even mentions the possibility of a service animal. There are occasional statements here or there, but there is nothing that spells out what a service animal is, where it belongs, where it doesn't belong, how it's to be handled. Those rules come from the Department of Justice, and those rules are under Titles 2 and 3 of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Those rules pertain to service animals, and only to service animals, everywhere, and nothing in the FHA, which comes from HUD, changes the requirements and restrictions concerning service animals. Now, it says on the slide, no matter what they call them. I'll explain that as we go along. Just keep in mind that service animals are defined in some detail by the Department of Justice under Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA. They are the rules that we go by when we talk about employees, coworkers, residences, clients, etc. When it's a service animal, it's covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The FHA tries to overlap but doesn't do it very well. We'll come back to that as well. The ESA, and ESA is the abbreviation we're going to use today for emotional support animal. ESA rules apply in housing. They come from the FHA, from the Fair Housing Act and HUD, and they only apply to housing. In other words, ESAs don't exist outside of housing. When it is not a service animal and it is not within the residence, it's a pet. It is not an ESA outside of the housing setting. And then you have ESA rules are commingled with service animal rules in the Air Carrier Access Act. And I'm going to give you some detail on that in just a minute. There are exceptions. Okay, let's go back up to the first bullet point on that slide. See where the word everywhere is in capital letters? It says the DOJ rules pertain to service animals everywhere. There is an exception. The DOJ rules do not pertain to service animals on airlines and in airports because the Air Carrier Access Act doesn't count them. It's its own Access Act as opposed to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we've got everywhere but airplanes. If it's a service animal, it's covered under the ADA. ESAs only exist in the housing setting under the HUD and FHA rules. Keep those two in mind. We'll deal with the Air Carrier Access Act as a separate piece, and we'll all do fine. You with me so far?
Yep, we sure are.
Then let's move on to slide number 5. What is a service animal? Service animals are dogs. That's it. Service animals are dogs. Well, okay, sometimes they can be miniature horses. Let's talk about that. Up until the coming of the rules in 2010, for the first 10 years or so after we started to see service animals appearing everywhere, there were other kinds of animals that were being used or considered as service animals. There was a place out in California that trained capuchin monkeys to serve as service animals for people who were quadriplegic. You heard all sorts of stories about service animals of all different species. And leading up to the issuance of the firm rules in 2010, the Department of Justice took a lot of comment from folks as to whether or not it should be limited to dogs. There was a pretty clear understanding as they got closer to it that it was either going to be dogs or it was going to say domesticated animals, which meant dogs or cats. In the end, they did not include cats. Now, having been a cat owner, my theory is that they did not include cats because a service animal by definition must be trained to do something, and you can't train a cat. But that may be my own personal bias based on my own personal experience. The bottom line is the Department of Justice said dogs. Service animals are dogs. There are lots of reasons why they went that route, but they went dogs. Now, where do the miniature horses come in? In that same 10 to 15 year period leading up to the 2010 guidelines, there was a facility, I believe out of North Carolina, was the main one, that was training miniature horses to serve as guides for people who were blind. They were specifically alternatives to guide dogs for people who were blind. The advantage of the miniature horse is that the miniature horse has an active working life of, I believe it's 22 years, whereas the service dog has an active working life generally of 7 to 8 years. So they could get one miniature horse and have it last with them and know them and do for them for 3 times as long without having to go back and get a new animal and get retrained, etc. That was the idea behind getting the miniature horses involved. That's why they started training them. With the coming of the rules in 2010, the Department of Justice would have liked to have said dogs and only dogs, but there were people who were using these miniature horses, and it seemed unfair to tell them what you are using and what you hope to use for some time to come. All of a sudden, as of tomorrow, you can't use that as a service animal anymore. So they made an exception for miniature horses. If you read the DOJ regs in no uncertain terms, it says service animals are dogs. There is an asterisk, and down at the bottom it said, in certain circumstances, miniature horses may also serve in the role of service animal if they're not disruptive. In other words, could you take a miniature horse into a Target store? Maybe. Could you take it into a fancy restaurant? No. So they basically said to the people who were using these miniature horses, so long as you behave yourself and don't try and press the boundaries, if you still want to use it to help you get around, we'll make allowances. But for our purposes from here on out, service animals are dogs. It's useful to note that the rules from DOJ sometimes state dogs and sometimes say animals, but the rules are clearly built with the understanding that service animals are dogs. So think service animal, dog. Let's go on to the next slide, please. What is a service animal? What's the definition? A service animal is a dog that's individually trained to do work or perform tasks for a person with a disability. That seems pretty straightforward. It's important to recognize that all of those pieces are part of the definition. So it's a dog, it's individually trained. This doesn't mean that a dog that's been through obedience school training with a dozen other dogs is trained. This says individually trained, and it's trained to do work or perform tasks for a person, a specific person with a disability. In other words, a service animal is not a service animal unless it has been individually trained to work as needed for a given individual with a disability. Service animals are used by people with a variety of disabilities. The obvious ones that we hear about all the time are guide dogs for people who are blind. You hear more these days about the possibility of hearing dogs for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. Certainly we've seen service animals in the use of people in wheelchairs, both for support and for picking things up and for helping them get to where they need to go, etc. There are service animals that are trained to respond to there are medical alert service animals, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute as well. But service animals that when a person with a certain medical condition starts to exhibit symptomology, the dog is trained to respond in a specific way to that symptomology. That is not the same as saying that the dog predicts that they're going to have a problem. There is no such thing as a dog that can be trained to predict that somebody is going to have a seizure. And that's the big one that comes up regularly in the popular press or in parlance, is people who will talk about their service dog that is trained to predicts when they're going to have a seizure. Anecdotal evidence says there are dogs that sense it in some way and that are alerted to it, but you cannot train a dog to predict a seizure. You can train a dog to respond when a seizure has occurred. There are dogs that are being trained now specifically to help people with autism and people on the spectrum. There are psychiatric service animals, and we will define those in a little bit more detail in a slide coming up as well. There are probably some others in there I've forgotten. But we use service animals. People with a variety of disabilities use service animals that are individually trained to do a specific disability-related task. The key points are that it's a dog, that it is trained, not in training, but is trained, and that it's for a person with a disability. By definition, pretty much, service animals are always about safety, independence, and dignity. The tasks that they are trained to do fall under one of those three or maybe more than one of those categories. For example, a guide dog for somebody who is blind is there largely for purposes of safety because they help that individual to independently navigate. Guide dogs for people in wheelchairs are largely there to help promote independence. So independence, safety, and dignity, keep those three things in mind when you're thinking in terms of service animals. Let's go on to slide 7. All right then, what's not a service animal? The quote that's shown in the first bullet point there comes directly out of the 2010 rules from the Department of Justice. Dogs whose sole function is to provide comfort or emotional support do not qualify as service animals under the ADA. Bottom line, emotional support animals are not service animals. By definition, they are not service animals. Therefore, the ADA rules do not apply. The right to access that is provided for a service animal does not apply for an ESA. If the dog's sole function is to provide comfort or emotional support, then it doesn't qualify. Pets are not service animals, and they're not protected under the rules. Again, the quote on the right-hand side of the slide comes directly from the DOJ rules. The definition does not affect or limit the broader definition of assistance animal under the Fair Housing Act or the broader definition of service animal under the Air Carrier Access Act. We'll talk about both of those in more detail, but the bottom line is the Fair Housing Act uses the term assistance animal rather than service animal. It's unfortunate that they do, because it has created all sorts of confusion, because they use the term assistance animal and they use it to mean both service animals and emotional support animals. And we'll talk about sorting those out later. By the same token, the Air Carrier Access Act uses the term service animal. It actually uses the term service animal, but it doesn't mean what DOJ means. A service animal under the Air Carrier Access Act is either what we know as a service animal or an ESA. Are you thoroughly confused? So is everybody else. Wording, I checked out the South Dakota state statutes, because in a lot of states, who gets the right of access and what's covered and what's involved is complicated by state laws that haven't been updated. Because for a while, in the early 2000s, it was not uncommon for states to adopt laws regarding service animals that included any species of animal. I'm in Ohio. There was a law on the books in Ohio, a state law, up until about 2 years ago, that said a service animal was any animal, and it included monkeys and horses and cats and anybody else if it was specifically trained to provide a disability-related service. So even though the ADA limited it to dogs, state law didn't. Well, fortunately, those laws seem to be getting updated at this point in time. You're even more fortunate, because I checked out the South Dakota statute, and it does not suggest anything outside the bounds of the ADA definition of service animal. It's a little bit fuzzy in its wording, but if you stick with what we've just covered as the rules regarding service animals, you should be fine. Okay, let's go to slide 8, please. Let's get this out of the way, and then we're not going to talk about the Air Carrier Access Act again. It had to be thrown in there because there is question about terminology, and because either you or some of your clients may occasionally be flying on a plane. But for the most part, we're going to be dealing with either the DOJ rules or the FHA rules. Okay, the Air Carrier Access Act is a statute in and of itself. The airlines and airports are not covered under the ADA. They're not covered under the ADA because they are covered under the Air Carrier Access Act from the Department of Transportation. The Title II and III regulations from DOJ don't pertain to airports and airplanes. The Department of Transportation has used the term service animal to mean both service animals and ESAs. They threw out a few rules as to what needs to happen, but they skipped most of the other things in terms of how you sort out the pieces, what's reasonable, what's not reasonable. This is why you read newspaper articles about ducks on airplanes or pot-bellied pigs running up and down the aisle, and they keep referring to them in the article as service animals, and you and I both know they're not service animals. Well, they're not by our definition. They're not under the DOJ, but they are under the Air Carrier Access Act. It's particularly confusing because when we get into emotional support animals, the rules that apply to service animals from the Department of Justice cannot be undone by anything in the FHA, but the rules that apply to service animals under the Department of Justice are undone under the Air Carrier Access Act. Bottom line, if you or one of your clients is getting ready to fly in an airplane, you need to check out the Air Carrier Access Act because the rules are different, including rules as to when you have to give notice that the individual is coming including rules about having to have documentation from a professional saying this really is a service animal. The rules are different if you're on airplanes or airports. Having recognized that and acknowledged that, leave it alone. If you have to ask the question of the airline that the person's going to fly on. Other than that, let's ignore the Air Carrier Access Act and talk about the things that we deal with every day. Before I go on, Bernie, any questions coming in on that?
Okay. If there's any questions, anyone, if you would put them on the chat on the bottom left-hand side, it looks like a little bubble. If you click on that to open up the chat. Otherwise, if you do #6, it'll unmute your phone line. *6 mutes it. So at this time, are there any questions? I'm not seeing any, Jane, or I'm not hearing anything.
Hearing none, we're moving on. Let's look at slide 9. Where can service animals go? The Department of Justice says generally Title II and Title III entities must permit service animals to accompany people with disabilities in all areas where members of the public are allowed to go. Restaurants. You get into issues with service animals when it comes to hospitals. Where are they allowed to go in the hospital? Pretty much any place where somebody can walk in off the street to visit a patient and walk in, they can go with their service animal. They cannot go into rooms that have into intensive care wards where people have to be, where there are questions about sterilization. Certainly they can't go into operating rooms, etc. So there are rules in place under the Department of Justice that say service animals can be restricted when there is imminent danger to others or in some cases to the animal. But they are few and far between. Other than sterilized areas, science laboratories, food, I'm guessing food processing plants, you probably could restrict the presence of a service animal. Eating establishments, no way. So, for the most part, generally speaking, service animals can go anywhere where the individual can go. The FHA allows for assistance animals in housing, even if there are no pet rules in place. They say that animals can be in the housing area if they are needed for the person with the disability. But again, the FHA rules only apply to housing. So the fact that they are allowed to have the animal there doesn't mean that they're allowed to have it anywhere else. Doesn't approve them to have it anywhere else. And again, the Air Carrier Access Act allows for animals on airplanes and in airports getting to and from those planes. Let's go to slide 10. What about training of service animals? Now we're operating under the Department of Justice rules. Animals can be self-trained. They do not have to be trained formally, and they're not required to carry any identification. So, in other words, there is no certification process for service animals. You're not a card-carrying disabled person with a service animal. All of these registries for service animals that are out there, they are all bogus. They are all fakes. The Department of Justice does not require that service animals be formally trained, and they are certainly not required to be certified or registered in any way. Service animals can be self-trained. They are to be trained to provide a specific disability-related service, or more than one, for a specific person with a disability. In my opinion, it's rare for someone to be able to provide credible self-training of a service animal. I'm sure there are individuals who are really good with dogs and have a great deal of experience with training the dog, before they started thinking about service animals who could probably figure out a way to do it, but those people are few and far between. For the most part, you need someone who is a professional dog trainer to provide the kind of reliable training of a service dog that is needed in order to provide safety, independence, and dignity for a person with a disability. That's an opinion. To suggest to your clients that they can self-train an animal as a service animal is probably doing a disservice. They need to get help. They need to get help from somebody who can help them make sure that the dog is reliably trained. That doesn't mean they have to go through one of the formal schools, although those schools exist and have the system down pat. They know how to make it work. They know what kinds of things dogs can be trained to do. They've got a system established, and anytime you have a client who can get a dog from a formally accredited school, hey, that's terrific. A good formal trainer can probably do a great job as well. But I think that to suggest to somebody, maybe if you had a service dog, it could help you with this, maybe you can train your own service dog, that's problematic, because the pieces that go into the kind of reliability and safety and behavior that go with being a service dog are generally beyond the self-training scope. Let's go on to slide number 11. How do you know if it's really a service dog? This quote comes directly from the DOJ rules. When it is not obvious what service an animal provides, only limited inquiries are allowed. Staff may ask two questions. Is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? Staff cannot ask about the person's disability, require medical documentation, require a special identification card or training documentation, or ask that the dog demonstrate its ability to perform the work or task. These rules are probably, this statement about verifying status for a service animal have probably created more problems for the people that I work with on a daily basis than anything else in the rules. I work regularly with colleges and universities. They have people who have supposedly service animals that they want to bring on campus into classes, into the residence halls, etc. And to say to that individual, to say to the campus, you're not allowed to ask them if they're a person with a disability. You're not allowed to ask them anything about their disability. You're only allowed to ask, is the dog a service animal required because of a disability, and what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? Limiting to those two questions means that somebody who thinks they know how to work the system can get away with a whole lot. There are a lot of problems in the way people apply these two questions. The reason the DOJ limited it to that was because they didn't want somebody taking their service dog to the movie theater with them or into a restaurant with them to be stopped at the door and made to justify their existence just in order to walk in the door a single time for a single involvement. So they said for animals that are going to be out in public, service animals, this is all you can ask. It was to limit the problems created for people with service animals in public places. Unfortunately, those rules have been misused a great deal. And part of the problem comes from people misquoting the questions that can be asked in a way that gets them in trouble. For example, the statement out of the DOJ rule says, is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? I would, if I was asking that question of someone, I would make a one-word change. I would say, is the dog a service animal required because of your disability? Because if you don't ask the question in that way, then somebody else who is walking who is hanging out with their friend's service animal could answer that question yes, because it is trained to help because of a disability. It's not really a service animal unless it's with a person with the disability who needs it as a service animal. Any other time it's a pet. So I would change that word to say because of your disability. The bigger problem comes with question 2. People tend to say, is the dog trained to provide a specific task? And you can easily get a yes-no answer, and you're stuck. That's not what DOJ said. DOJ said, what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? It asked specifically about what it is that the dog has been trained to do. When you get questions, or when you get answers to something like that, along the lines of, he calms me down when I am upset, how do you separate that from an emotional support animal? My answer would be to ask the question again. I need some clarification. What work or task has the dog been trained to do? What is it trained to do to calm you down? There's a lot of question about these two questions, and you hear a lot in the literature and when you read the professional comments about asking the two questions, and if they've got the right answers, you're stuck with it, etc. My theory is that if the Department of Justice hadn't intended that you use the two questions to sort out what's really a service animal from what's not, they wouldn't have bothered with the two questions. They would have just said, if they tell you it's a service animal, you're stuck with it. They didn't do that. They gave us two questions that we can ask to sort out the pieces. I think we have a right to use those questions appropriately. You can't ask about their disability. You can't require medical documentation. You can't, there is no training or certification documentation that is necessary. But you can press for complete answers to those two questions. Is the animal required because of your disability? And what work or task has the dog been trained to provide? Okay, let's go on to slide 12. The problems, more problems as far as verifying status. The FHA details procedures for verifying legitimacy of an animal that works as an ESA. But the rules that they have for ESAs, which we'll get to in a minute, are not allowed for service animals. In other words, you're not allowed to ask if the service animal, you're not allowed to ask about the person's disability if it's a service animal. You are allowed to ask about the person's disability under the FHA if they want to bring in an emotional support animal. So the FHA rules say you may ask about their disability if they want to bring an animal in, if they want to bring an assistance animal in, except that they use assistance animal to cover service animals too, and you can't ask about the disability for the service animal. The use of the term assistance animal screws things up. By the same token, the Air Carrier Access Act uses the term service animals to apply to both kinds. And you can ask for written documentation for their service animals. But those are different service animals than the ADA service animals. Are you following all this?
Yep, we're still here.
Do we have any questions? Okay. Do you have any questions showing up thus far, Bernie?
No questions on the left-hand side. Just to let you know that we got an hour and 15 minutes left because it will cut off at exactly 4 o'clock. So looks like we're pretty well on target.
Let's go on to slide 13. I threw this one in specifically for you folks. The state of South Dakota is largely silent on the issue of service animals, which is surprising, by the way. Most states have something, and it's usually bad, that talks about service animals. It's usually bad because it's old, and it's not brought up to date, and it's not in keeping with what's in the DOJ rules. The state of South Dakota has very little. There are rules suggesting that you may not have surcharges for participation, or rules that make it a misdemeanor for someone to interfere with somebody using a service animal. but nothing else specific. In other words, you cannot charge extra for somebody who brings a service animal into a facility. You cannot charge for an extra seat in a theater, or you can't ask for a pet deposit before allowing them to come into certain places. You can't levy surcharges for participation. And it is illegal to interfere with somebody who is using a service animal. But beyond that, South Dakota doesn't say much of anything, and that makes life easier for you. You get to go back to the federal rules under the Department of Justice. Let's go on to slide 14. The responsibility to accommodate and the restrictions. We're stuck with general rules for all situations. The Department of Justice has said, we know there is some problem, that this is a problem and we're working on it, but we haven't gotten any resolution. So in other words, again, back to those two questions. The questions which were meant to be vague so that they didn't interfere with people out in the general public don't really give us the kind of direction we'd like to have for an ongoing exposure to the animal in a workplace, in a school setting, whatever. We're stuck with it. In general, though, but there are some rules that we know of. In general, reactions to others, allergies, fears, concerns about costs are not a reason to limit the presence of a service animal. It is not uncommon for someone to say, what if there is somebody else in the environment who is deathly afraid of dogs? The Department of Justice makes it very clear that you may not limit the presence of a service animal because of allergies or fears of others. How are you supposed to deal with it? The Department of Justice is a lot less clear about that. They basically say, work it out. They tell you you can't limit the presence of the service animal. They don't tell you how to get around it. Service animals can be excluded only in limited situations, such as when their presence would put others in danger, and we talked about this. Sterile areas, science labs, equipment where the animal's presence could be a problem because it could interfere with people moving swiftly between equipment, etc. Only when there's danger. Let's go on to slide 15. The responsibility to accommodate and restrictions. The FHA governs accommodations in housing, kind of. Again, we're going to talk about ESAs in more detail, but the FHA rules apply to emotional support animals. And since the ADA rules do not apply to emotional support animals, the only rules we have in general about ESAs come from the FHA rules, and they apply to housing and only to housing. The FHA rules regarding ESAs in housing do not alter the ADA rules regarding service animals in housing. You are not allowed to require registration of service animals. We talked about that, just for the record, nor are you allowed to require certification or registration of ESAs. There is no such thing. There are people making big bucks online selling certification. There is no such thing. On one of the listservs that I monitor for disability services personnel, somebody recently got on and said that she went to one site where for $69 she could have gotten a vest certifying her 11-year-old as an emotional support animal. But she decided, A, it wasn't worth it for the joke, and B, they didn't have a size big enough for them. These sites regarding registration of service animals and ESAs are all bogus. Make sure your clients know that, and don't waste their money getting what they think will be certification that will not get them what they want, will not get them what they need. The rules make it very clear that the handler or the owner is responsible for any damage caused by a service animal. You cannot exclude the service animal from being there, but if the animal does damage, you can charge that damage back to the owner. And the handler or the owner must clean up after the service dog. there are exceptions made. There are certain places where there are rules that say if the individual, because of their disability, is unable to clean up after the dog, here are the options that are available to you. I know on some college campuses they say you can hire somebody to clean up after your dog for you, and on some college campuses they'll say contact this office, and as long as you stay within this area, we'll police it, we'll clean up after the dog. That's only supposed to be for people who with disabilities who can't clean up themselves, somebody in a wheelchair, etc. But under most circumstances, the handler or the cleaner must clean up after the dog. Okay, let's go on to slide 16. More responsibilities to accommodate and restrictions. Food service establishments must allow service animals in public areas. And patrons with service animals cannot be isolated or treated less favorably. No surcharges allowed. You cannot designate a special section that is only for people in wheelchairs or with service animals. There was a major agency finding against Portland State University a couple years back because they established a specific dormitory and said if you have a service animal, you have to live here. It was the one dorm that didn't have carpeting. And they said, we think service animals are going to screw up our carpets, so if you want to have a service animal, you have to live in this dorm. And the Department of Justice said, think again. You may not isolate people with disabilities because of the presence of their service animal. As far as responsibilities are concerned, however, there is nothing within the ADA that requires a landlord, an institution of higher ed, an office, etc., to take care of someone's service animal for them. The responsibility for the care of the service animal falls solely to the person with the disability. And there's a special note here. The status of service animals in training is sometimes confusing. In a lot of states, they give the same rights of access to a service animal in training as they do to a full service animal. You don't have to worry about that. State of South Dakota doesn't. Bottom line, if somebody tells you they are training this to be a service animal or this is a service animal in training, you have the right to say, bring it back when it's trained. It's not a service animal yet. Okay, let's go on to slide 17. And we basically covered this. The dreaded 2 questions. We dealt with that earlier on. Let's go on to slide 18. Before I start talking about emotional support animals in detail, let's get some questions out about service animals.
Okay.
I'll give you a minute or two. And
yeah. Again, if you have
what
questions,
you got, Bernie?
either do the chat. I will ask them for you. Or if you would do #6, I believe, unmutes your phone line. Here's one question from Cindy Ryan. Are college dorms covered under ADA or FHA rules?
Okay. College dorms are covered under both. The ADA clearly applies to colleges and universities. If it's a public institution, it's covered under Title II. If it's a private institution, it's covered under Title III. And so the rules regarding service animals clearly apply to anything and everything that goes on in the college, and that includes what goes on in their residence halls. The FHA rules do apply to college dormitories. That was a big question for a while, a couple of years back. There was a lot of discussion as to whether the FHA actually applied. The jury's in on that one, and the answer is yes. The Fair Housing Act does apply to college dormitories. There are still a lot of attorneys and some housing personnel who would like to think that's not true because they're not landlords in the traditional sense. They're wrong, and they're going to lose. The case law has consistently shown that colleges and university dormitories do fall under the FHA.
Okay. And I assume you'll go into emotional support animals here
Yeah,
in
that's
further detail,
the
because
next thing on our schedule.
that will get more into the college dorms, where I think where some of the bigger issues are. So I don't see any other questions being asked, so I think you're covering it very well, Gene.
Okay, we'll go on from there and we'll come back to things as we need to. Let's go on to slide number 19. What about ESAs? We have some rules provided in haphazard form in the Fair Housing Act, and we're fleshing them out as we go based on some case precedents and logic and common sense. One of the statutes that specifically speaks, the only statute that specifically speaks to emotional support animals, is the Air Carrier Access Act. This is one of those how did this happen kind of thing. In the Americans with Disabilities Act, there is reference to, in the DOJ rules, there is reference to the fact that animals that provide emotional support strictly by their presence. And in the Fair Housing Act, there is reference to assistance animals may provide emotional support, but they don't use the term emotional support animal. The Air Carrier Access Act does, and that was written in 2003. We've got a clearly defined term, service animal, under the DOJ with definitions that go with it. There is nothing that clearly defines a term in the same way when it comes to ESAs, but ESA, emotional support animal, has become the terminology of choice because it's the most logical reference and it is supported by what else is there. It's become, as it says on the slide, the term in common use, and it's what we'll be using for this discussion. I would distinguish between an emotional support animal, an ESA, and a therapy animal, and a comfort animal. Therapy animals are animals that are specifically involved in individual therapy with a person with a disability for purposes of improving their disability status. For example, you may be familiar with therapeutic riding schools, where people with disabilities are taught to ride, and it can do things like improving their trunk stability and their balance, and in some cases their confidence level. Or there are several places in Florida and California that have people with disabilities who are literally swimming with the dolphins, where those animals are used in their therapy, where there is someone working with them to improve their status. ESAs are not therapy animals. They are not part of the therapy. They do nothing more or less than help the individual to feel better because of their presence. And then there used to be the term comfort animal used. It's too vague to give us any clear understanding of what's happening. So let's stick with ESAs. And let's go on to slide number 20. ESAs in the Fair Housing Act. We've been saying this all along. The Fair Housing Act uses the term assistance animal, and it means both service animals and ESAs. And that's a problem because some of the rules apply to service animals, some to ESA, some to both. And when you use the term assistance animal, it doesn't help you sort it out. For example, let's look at the next slide, slide 21. You can ask for documentation of need from a professional. You can't ask that for a service animal in housing. You can ask that for an ESA. So you can't say to somebody who is bringing a service animal into the dorm or into the apartment, we need to see a letter from your doctor saying this is really a service animal. You can ask somebody who wants to bring an ESA into the dorm or into an apartment, we need documentation from a mental health professional saying that this is an emotional support animal necessary because of your disability. Next bullet, they're approved only for housing. They may not be out in public. Service animals, no. Service animals get to go out in public anytime they want. They are also in the dorm, but they are meant to have access everywhere. ESAs, they're only in housing. As soon as you take them out of the dorm, they're no longer ESAs. They're no longer protected. How's this for ironic? Can they be left unattended in a dwelling? Service animals can't. ESAs can. You can't leave a service animal unattended in a dwelling because it's only a service animal when it is in service to the person with the disability. If they're not with the person with the disability, it's a pet. ESAs, on the other hand, are meant to be in the housing setting when the individual comes home to give them comfort and support while they are within the housing setting. But legally, you can't leave service animals alone in the room or in the apartment, but you can leave an ESA alone even if there's a no pet statute. Must there be training? By definition, it's only a service animal if it's trained. By definition, ESAs are not trained to do anything. They just are. Both service animals and ESAs are listed as assistance animals under the Fair Housing Act's definition. It's tremendously problematic, and I would encourage you, when you're discussing animals, not to use the term assistance animal, even if the FHA does. Discuss a service animal or an ESA and make it clear which one you've got, because that tells you something about what rules apply.
I do have a question here, Jane, and it's from Steve Stewart, and I got to try to decipher his question here. He wants to know, under reasonable modification, must we allow, say, a lap dog unless we can demonstrate fundamentally alter nature program or direct threat to safety of others?
Okay. Must you allow a lap dog as a service animal or as an ESA? As a service animal, probably not, because the dog must be trained to provide some disability-related service. And generally speaking, the lap dog isn't trained to provide any service. In the housing context, we're going to talk in just a minute about what the animal is, how the FHA approves the presence of an ESA, but it has nothing to do with access. It has nothing to do with must they have this in order to be able to function, which is what you got with a service animal. In this case, the ESA read me the question again.
I'm struggling on it too. You got to meet Steve sometime. Steve wants to know, under reasonable modification, must we allow, let's say, a lap dog unless we can demonstrate fundamentally alter nature of program or direct threat to safety of others?
Okay. If the term reasonable modification generally comes from the ADA, so I'm going to assume that he's asking about a service animal, in which case the term reasonable accommodation, what did it say?
Reasonable modification must be allowed.
Reasonable modification. Okay. If it's a service animal, the term reasonable modification, which comes from the ADA, doesn't apply, because you don't get to approve a service animal. It's not an accommodation that you approve or don't approve under any circumstances. It just is. If it is a service animal under the ADA, the individual with the disability is entitled to have that service animal there. The issues of undue being disruptive or
a threat to safety
an undue
of others.
burden or the safety of others, those issues are not a reason to not approve a service animal. If those issues arise, you may have the service animal removed, but you don't get to, in other words, the individual has the right to bring the service animal. If the service animal proves itself to be a danger to others, then it may be removed. If the service animal barks and interferes with a class or whatever is going on a regular basis, then you may say the animal can no longer be here. But you cannot make an assumption that the animal will be problematic if it's a service animal and say no to it in advance. It would be really hard to find. I'm having trouble figuring out a way that a lapdog can be a danger or a threat to others.
And Steve, if we didn't ask your question correctly, you'll have to do in the chat to clarify your question. So we'll kind of move forward here and see.
But in general, the bottom line is, if it's a service animal, you're not approving their having the service animal. They've already got approval from the Department of Justice. They just are. ESAs are a whole different thing. ESAs do have to be approved before they come in.
So let me ask this, just expand on it. Let's say it is a trained service animal, trained dog, guide dog, and takes to the class, but in that classroom there is a student with severe allergies to animals, to dogs.
Okay. The Department of Justice says, find a way to make it work for both of them. They have said you may not say no to the service animal, but they haven't told you how to get around it. So when you get into those situations, what generally happens is somebody sits down with both of the parties that are involved, separately hopefully, and says, all right, what are we going to do so that both of you can be comfortable in this situation? So it may be that the student with the allergy sits on the far side of the room and the student with the guide dog promises to only be on the near side of the room. Or it may be that a student with a service animal chooses to leave the animal in the department chair's office while they're in that particular class. You can't tell them they have to do that, but you could offer it as an option. The bottom line is they say, work it out. They don't tell you anything more. But they do say the fact that there's somebody there who has an allergy or a fear doesn't override the individual's right to have the service animal.
Okay. What I may do at the very end is just unmute the video conference sites to see if they want to expand or clarify our question a little bit more. So we can go on to the next slide.
Okay. Let's go on to slide 22. Again, things that do and don't work for service animals and ESAs. Must be registered or approved. This is the issue of accommodation. That doesn't mean registered by one of these bogus sites. This means that if you have an apartment or if you have a dormitory and say you can't bring the animal in unless you have given us advance notice and gotten it approved, you don't get to approve a service animal, but you do get to approve an ESA in advance. You can ask for information and prior notice, etc. Is it necessary for access for the individual with a disability? A service animal, by definition, is only a service animal if it's necessary for access. The ESA has nothing to do with access. The actual wording used in the Fair Housing Amendment says that the person with a disability may have the ESA there if it is necessary for their full benefit or enjoyment of this setting. That's the only phrase that's there, full benefit or enjoyment, not about access. Breed, size, and weight limitations. The ADA says you may not limit someone's use of a service dog based on breed, size, or weight limitations. Breed becomes an issue in places where they have local bans regarding, for example, pit bulls. If there is a local civic ordinance prohibiting pit bulls and somebody's got a service animal, a pit bull that they are using as a service animal, the ADA takes precedence over that local ordinance. Then again, service animals are only dogs. When it comes to ESAs, you can say no on the basis of breed, size, or weight limitations, if you can show that it is problematic to have an animal of that size or whatever in that space that's made available. The kicker, however, is that ESAs are not limited to dogs, which is how you get the duck on the airplane and the pot-bellied pig in the dorm room and the rest of it. ESAs are not limited by species. We all wish they would be. And it does allow for the possibility that you may say no to a given ESA because you've got a problem with how it would fit in the circumstance. For example, for reasons I have not been able to fathom, I know of some disability services providers at colleges and universities who have allowed snakes as ESAs. If it were me making the decision, I wouldn't. I would say to the individual, you may have an ESA, but you can't have this ESA. I don't see snakes as being appropriate to a dormitory setting because logically the only way that having the snake there provides them with emotional support is if they take them out and handle them. And if they take them out of the cage to handle them, they can get out. And having it within the system is just too problematic to discuss. So I think you can say no to certain species and whatever with an ESA and get away with it, because there's a difference between approving the idea of an ESA and approving a specific ESA. But dogs, you don't get to limit breed and size. ESAs you do. Okay? And here's the other one. Assistance animals. Are you limited to asking the two questions? Is this a service animal necessary for your disability, and what, if any, disability-related service is it trained to provide? Those two questions are the only things you can ask about a service animal. But for an ESA, you can ask anything you need to establish that this is truly necessary for full benefit or enjoyment, which means the first question is this a person with a disability? Is this somebody who has a substantial limitation in a major life activity, and for that matter, in terms of a mental health disability? Emotional support animal. You don't get an emotional support animal if you're blind. Emotional support animals are there for people who have emotional disabilities. You can ask about the disability for the ESA, not for the service animal. Okay, let's go on to slide 23.
So my
This gives you
assumption that you at least ask the person, is this a service animal or emotional support animal?
Yes.
Okay.
I probably, if you really were approaching somebody and knew nothing about it, I would probably ask a general question in terms of what purpose does this animal serve for you? Probably go about it that way and try and sort out from there, is it a service animal or an ESA? Okay, slide 23. This is the actual wording out of the Fair Housing Act. An assistance animal is an animal that provides assistance or performs tasks for the benefit of a person with a disability, or provides emotional support that alleviates one or more identified symptoms. That's the reference to emotional support animals. Everything else, works, performs tasks for a person with a disability, that's a service animal. Because now you're talking about actively doing something, and then all of a sudden it says, or provides emotional support. Notice that in the next couple of sentences, it describes a service animal. Assistance animals perform many disability-related functions, including but not limited to guiding individuals who are blind or have low vision, alerting individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing to sounds, providing protection or rescue assistance, pulling a wheelchair, fetching items, alerting people to impending seizures, and then in bold, or providing emotional support to persons with disabilities who have a disability-related need for such support. So again, they define assistance animals as being service animals and then say, or maybe they're just ESAs. You'll notice that I've put alerting persons to impending seizures in italics. It's to remind you there's no way that the dog can be trained to alert to an impending seizure. The dog can be trained to respond to a seizure. Okay, slide 24. What about animals outside the home? What are you going to do, what are you going to do about animals that are not service animals when they're out and about instead of in the residence hall? So in other words, or in residence, the individual has an ESA, has gone through the appropriate steps to have that ESA approved so that they can have their ESA in housing with them. And I'm not going to get into the tricky little part about you've got a dog and you got to take the dog outside to relieve itself. I would not consider the dog outside the dorm just long enough to relieve itself and then come back in as being out and about. What if they've got an ESA in the dorm and they want to take it out on campus to get a little exercise and run around a little bit and just in general be free? What do you do then? Well, what you're not going to do is you're not going to call that animal an ESA, and you're not going to apply the same rules that you do to either ESAs or service animals, because the approved ESA outside of the residence is not an ESA, and it certainly is not a service animal because it's not trained to do anything. They'd be evaluated the same way as any other request for an exception to policy, in this case, a no pets policy. Again, I work a great deal with colleges and universities, and what we tell folks is the animal that is approved as an ESA in the residence hall, if the student says, I really want to bring it to class with me because the same emotional support that it gives me when I'm at home, I'd like to have that emotional support when I'm in the classroom. That request gets evaluated under the same rules under Section 504 that the disability services provider uses to evaluate any other request for an exception to policy. The policy is no pets, and that ESA outside of the residence, that's a pet. There may be circumstances in which it is justifiable to allow somebody an exception to policy to bring the pet with them. That's decided on a case-by-case basis, and it generally is not approved, but there are always exceptions.
Yeah, Jane, give me a second here.
Okay.
We're trying to reconnect our video conference sites, and
Okay.
I'm showing that the video conference is. Let me double check here. So nothing. Okay. Gotta love technology.
You still there?
I'm still there. I'm still here.
Okay.
It's just the people connected to the video.
I heard a click. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, the people on the video conference said they just lost the connection, and we're just reconnecting here. Okay, Nathan. I'm going to call the DDN people, so I'll put you on hold for a minute.
Okay. You still there, Bernie?
Yes, I'm still here. We're just seeing if we can get some final to get them video conference site connected back in. That's what we're having a problem with.
Okay, and I'm still on?
Yeah, yes, you're still on with the people on the Skype for
Okay.
Business. It's just the video conference people we lost connection.
Yeah, but he needs to add us to his call as he dropped out. Right.
And I did this about 3 times. I'm gonna add it again here. Invite
And then
864 @ttn.sd.qb.
now do you start video call? I think if you right click on down below where you type it in.
I just typed it in.
Yeah, and then down below it, you should see that down below where you typed it in.
Yeah.
And right click on that.
It's a Skype for Business call. Cannot be reached, it says. I don't know what that. I don't know. We're going to have to continue on. We only got 30 minutes here.
Okay.
Okay. Jane,
Okay.
go ahead.
All right, let's pick up from slide number 25.
Okay.
How will you define the difference? How will you define ESAs? My only recommendation is that you define them separately. Don't make the same mistake that HUD and the Department of Transportation make. Define service animals as those animals covered under the ADA rules. Define ESAs as emotional support animals that are covered in housing under the FHA rules, and don't mix them up. Don't use one sentence to describe both kinds of animals. They're different entities covered under different laws. Which brings us to the next slide, to slide 26. This may be the most difficult distinction to make. The difference between an ESA, an emotional support animal, and a psychiatric service animal. Psychiatric service animals are covered under the ADA. ESAs clearly are not covered under the ADA. How do you sort it out when you're talking about a dog in both cases? By definition, a psychiatric service animal is a dog that's specifically trained to respond in a consistent manner to the status of their owner. Remember, the tasks that they're trained to provide have to do with safety, independence, or dignity. By definition, an ESA can be any species
Can you guys hear me okay?
Intercall. Please enter. Thank you. If you are the leader, press star now. After the tone, state your name, followed by the pound or hash sign.
Bernie.
Thank you. You will now be placed into conference. To mute your line, press star 6. To unmute, press pound 6. Pound 6.
Okay, this is Bernie. Hold on here.
There and make the individual feel calmer. We've always known that pets have a positive effect in our lives. That's why we feed our dogs instead of eating them. The idea is that having the animal there makes a positive difference in the individual's calmness and stability, and that's just great. But it's not the same as being a trained service animal. Okay, let's go on to 27. What about the removal of an ESA? Under what circumstances can a landlord say the ESA can't stay? The first is if the animal poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others or causes substantial property damage to the property of others. There was a circumstance last year at a college in Pennsylvania where the student applied to bring her pot-bellied pig in an ESA, and there were some really complicated pieces that went with it. But the bottom line was that even though they had great trepidations, they allowed the student to bring the pot-bellied pig as her ESA into her dorm room. the pig did substantial damage to the dorm room. And when it was time to move out, it cost like $2,000 to fix the damage. And they sent the student a bill because part of the contract they'd signed said that the student would be responsible for any damage done. And the student paid the $2,000 bill and then said, oh, and by the way, I'm bringing Piggy back to campus in the fall. And they said, oh, no, you're not. They could not, on the basis of their fear of what would happen, say no to the animal. But on the basis of the evidence before them, they could refuse to allow her to bring it back in. If the animal's presence presents a fundamental alteration of the housing setting, this would primarily be an issue in circumstances where the animal was disruptive of everyone else in the housing setting. The dog who, when the individual is not present in the apartment, barks incessantly and disturbs everyone else in the area. The animal where the owner is not taking proper care and they've got a litter box that you can smell 3 hallways down. If the presence of the animal is disruptive to other residents, then you may say, sorry, it's got to go. If the owner doesn't comply with established rules, or if the animal or its presence creates an unmanageable disturbance or interference in the housing unit. One of the rules that we suggest that colleges and universities put into their contract regarding ESAs, we make it very clear that the student must name someone else who will be responsible for the animal in an emergency, and that someone else cannot be somebody living in the dorm. Why? Because it's only an ESA when it's with the individual with the disability. If it's not with the individual with the disability, it's a pet, and pets aren't allowed in the dorm. So they've got to name an emergency contact who, if something happens to that individual with a disability, will take responsibility for removing the animal from the dorm. Part of the reason we make them put that into the contract is because what happens when the individual who has the ESA does not play by the rules, or does have a litter box that smells, or a dog that took a nip at somebody along the line? What happens when you have to say, I'm sorry, the animal has to be removed? What you typically get from students in college dormitories, at least, is, oh, well, I'll be going home in 3 weeks. I'll take it with me when I go then. No way. Written into the rules, written into the contract for having an ESA, should be something that says specifically, if it is determined that the animal must be removed, you will have 48 or 72 hours to remove it. And if it's not removed by that time, the landlord or the university will take responsibility for removing that animal and taking it to the nearest animal shelter or wherever you decide to take it. And if the student says, but I won't be going home, I have no place to put the animal, the answer is, you have an emergency contact. Dump it with the emergency contact until you can get it home 3 weeks from now, but it's not staying in our dorm, or it's not staying in this apartment. I would encourage you, when you have people, when you are looking at situations of ESAs in housing, to think about the times when the ESA doesn't work out and it's got to be removed, and what the rules will be in those circumstances as well. Okay, go on to slide number 28. I've got a if there's time slide here, but before we get to that, let's see if you all have any other questions. We've got about 20 minutes to go.
Okay, we do have the DDN sites back on. Had a little hiccup onto there.
Okay.
So again, if you guys have a question, it is pound 6 to unmute. And if I can find the DDN listing on here, I'll unmute you guys at the DDNs also to see if you guys have any questions at this point in time. Any questions, anyone?
Questions about service animals? Questions about ESAs?
I'm not seeing any, so we can continue,
Well,
Jane.
let me go on with a couple more of these pieces that are on slide 28. ESA documentation for sale. I've mentioned this a couple of times. There are a whole lot of places out there that are bogus. There are some ways that we are pursuing getting some of these people nailed legally for what they're doing. And when I say nailed legally, for example, there is a whole cottage industry growing among marriage and family therapy counselors in the state of Oklahoma who have gone into the business, and we've seen letters from 3 or 4 different therapists in different cities that are providing documentation that this is a person with an emotional disability and they do need to have this animal in order to have emotional support. And to prove it, they have registered the animal with the National Service or Emotional Support Animal Registry, and you're stuck with it. Oh, and by the way, I got $150 for writing this letter, and if you want the letter within 3 days, it's an extra $50. Going on these sites is just kind of appalling in terms of the kinds of things that they are willing to put their professional credentials against. It is complicated by the fact that some of the larger sites, like, for example, the Emotional Support Animal Registry, the person with the disability finds their way to the Emotional Support Animal Registry, and they farm out the evaluation to somebody who presumably has the right credentials after their name, so that the evaluation of the need for the emotional support animal is based on a written survey to 11 questions that they're using to determine that this is a person with a disability and therefore has need of an emotional support animal. I can't even begin to tell you some of the abuses as you go through and look at these sites. I can tell you, if you decide to investigate it on your own, after you've hit about the 3rd or 4th site, for months afterwards, your Google will feed you websites that have bogus certification for service animals along the way, because they picked up on the fact that you were looking at all. Part of the problem is that while the websites are all bogus, and my guess is they know they're bogus, but they figure they stop just shy of saying something actively that's illegal. But that doesn't mean that what they're doing is not misguided and not providing what they say. But the problem is that the fact that the sites are bogus doesn't mean that the individual with a disability who has a real need has a bogus need or knows that the sites are bogus. So there's a whole lot of people who are wasting good money applying through these sites that they believe to be providing them with what they need to get an emotional support animal or to have their dog declared a service animal, when in fact that's money down the drain because it's not going to get them what they need. But it's not their fault that they are misled by what's going on. So if I had one charge to you as you work with voc rehab clients across the state, is if you have individuals who are thinking about getting a service animal or an emotional support animal, make sure they understand that that anytime you can apply for it over the internet, it's not legitimate, and that's not money well spent. That's going to be money wasted. Let's talk about weird animals. Thank goodness service animals are limited at this point to dogs, and that makes life a little bit easier. But the things that I've seen offered up for emotional support animals, we talked about the pig. I've seen ducks on the airplane. There's a great video from the New Yorker magazine that one of their reporters did a couple of years ago, where he was trying to show how silly the rules were. And he took a llama into a glass shop in New York City. He took a turkey into an historical building, and people are just afraid of saying no. They don't understand what the rules are. The fact that it is legal to have an emotional support animal of any species doesn't mean that it is logical. And again, if you're working with clients and looking at what kind of animal they could get that would allow them to have emotional support in their residence facility or in their residence, if they're thinking about the possibility, don't have them go for a tarantula. Have them go for a puppy dog. It may be harder to train. There may be other circumstances, but it's not going to be questionable just by virtue of this is just silly. I have seen reports of students bringing in lizards and snakes, and the kicker is rats. We see a lot of requests coming by on the listservs for disability services offices where they've got somebody who wants to bring their emotional support rats, and that's plural, and that's a problem in and of itself. They will tell you that rats are social animals, and therefore they can't have just one rat because it will get lonesome. So they need to have 2 or 4 emotional support rats, to which the response is the law promises access or comfort and benefit and enjoyment to the individual with a disability. It's not the Animals with Disabilities Act. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act. You only get one. I just today on one of the listservs that I monitor, somebody came across with a question about a student who has illegally had 2 cats in her dorm room for at least 3 or 4 months. And they caught her, and they said, you didn't apply, you didn't ask, these cats have got to go. But they have some concern about whether the student may, in fact, legitimately be able to apply for an emotional support animal. And they just know she's going to come back and say, these cats are dependent on each other, they keep each other company, I don't want to keep one, I want to keep them both. And what do they say in those circumstances? Well, it's a really tough one, but the bottom line is we do not provide support for the animals. We provide support for you as a student as necessary. And unless there are extenuating circumstances regarding the student's need, the answer is only one. I could go on with other examples, but any other questions showing
That was
up?
one of the questions that I think you answered, and someone asked, how many ESAs can a person have? And you said only one. Right.
There would be very, very, very rare exceptions where you might be willing to approve more because of circumstances. But from a logic standpoint, it does not make sense to say that this animal, I've seen someone who came up with a reason for needing 2 emotional support dogs because this one helped her when she was depressed and that one helped her when she was anxious. I'm sorry, I'm not buying it, folks. There is no reason why there is no reason to believe that there is such significant difference in the support that someone gets from one animal than from another. And when it comes to ESAs, you do get to say yes or no. And I would say no to that.
There's no other questions. Does anyone have a question? This would be the time to #6 to unmute. And I'll see if I can find the DDN people. They're already unmuted. If there's a question, you can put it in the chat. Or you can ask it. We have about 10 minutes left. I do need to talk to people about the where they can do this, complete the online survey.
Okay.
Just in case we do run out of time, that we do get that covered. Very last slide of the handout has, if you need to continue education credits, whether the CRCC or the Certified Employment Support Professional, you do need to complete that online survey. And it's at the Survey
This is
Monkey.
on slide 30, you're saying?
Yes, slide 30. And it's surveymonkey.com/r/SERVANIM. And in order to, the code that you'll need to enter in on there to show that you listened to the session would be DOGS, DOGS. I just want to make sure I got that covered before we ran out of time, because it just, system will shut down right at the 4 o'clock. So is there any questions for Jane at this point in time? We do have just a few more minutes left. You would have to again do the #6 to unmute your phone.
Could you give that website again for?
Yes.
Could you give that website again for that survey?
Yes. It is www.surveymonkey, all one word, .com /r/SERVANIM. You should also have, if you downloaded the PowerPoint presentation on our website, it has it on there too. And remember, you'll ask for a survey code, and that is DOGS, DOGS. And I don't believe it's cap sensitive.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
I would just add, if we're done, that on that slide 30, I've given you my email address, which is just janejero@aol.com. And I am available to answer any questions you think of after the fact. Please don't hesitate to be in touch.
The Mitchell office asked, in the event that providers come back and watch the video later, when it's uploaded, will they be able to get credits? Yes, they will. But we're only going to issue the credits probably till the end of January. We're not going to be going out to SurveyMonkey every month and see if there's new people that have watched it. So it'll be basically end of January is when we'll run the report to see who all's completed the survey and entered in the survey code of DOGS, and that's what we will enter in. And we do ask that people be honest on this and not share the code with people, because we do have to. It's a way that we can provide continuing education credits and assure that people are participating in a training. Jane does have her email address there. And Jane, did I kind of butcher your last name? Is it Jaro? Is that how you pronounce it?
It's Jero, like arrow with a J in front of it.
Jaro, okay. And it's Jane, JeneJarrow @AOL.com.
Right.
Other questions? It's got about 5 minutes and we'll be bumped off the system. I see a few people already dropped off. Jane, I do want to thank you for your presentation.
It was a pleasure, and I look forward to being in touch with folks from South Dakota again soon.
Yeah, we'll see you back in South Dakota for a disability coordinators meeting here. I also want to thank Janet Ball and Jennifer Guther for helping set this up. I do apologize that we do have technical problems. It does happen. It seems that we did a little hiccup, but able to get through it and continue on. And again, we hope to have the video posted out to our website here before this week is over. So with that, I guess session's over, and I do want to thank everyone. Again, and thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Okay. Thank you, guys.